we still talk and our leaders still talk as though we're living in the post-1989 America-dominated global order. But actually, that world has melted away. We pretend it hasn't, and that hurts us. The new world is one of shifting, unpredictable, fragmented conflict. And we've got to understand that if we are to develop a viable strategy for dealing with Russia, Ukraine, Taiwan, China, Israel, Palestine. Because these are not isolated conflicts, but fronts of a loose global war playing out in a world without a world order. To get at the gap between the reality of our global order and how we talk about it, we have to start with a 200-year-old Western idea that says that modernization is Westernization. And it goes like this. The world is going to look kind of like us, because if you get economic growth anywhere in the world, you're going to get liberal democracy. In a way, that reached its pinnacle in 1989, when Francis Fukuyama famously argued that in principle, if not in practice, the world would converge on a species-wide civilization centering on democratic capitalism.
You know, it used to be that there were many alternative forms of government. And one by one, in this century, every one of those has collapsed. Liberal democracy is really all there is now.
And when I went up to Oxford for my MPhil over 10 years after the End of History article, the 1950s social science that linked economic growth with democratization was still hugely dominant. And for a while, if you bought into this story, it kind of looked like it could be true. The Soviet Union collapsed. In the 1990s, East European states adopted capitalism and made steps toward democratization.
Я прекращаю свою деятельность.
A new world order where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind.
Now, I have to point out that even at the time, it was clear that this story wasn't true, because it weren't liberal values that brought down the Soviet Union. It was nationalism, decay, and a palpable perception of illegitimacy. But that wasn't how we chose to view it. Countless US administrations saw their role as giving a helping hand to history as it marched toward American-inspired freedom.
When it comes to human rights and religious freedom, China remains on the wrong side of history. We must work to speed history's course.
And there was this pious belief that autocracy was just froth atop a glass that could be blown off to reveal the universal democratic tendencies beneath.
The tyrant has fallen and Iraq is free.
And this hubris played a role in some of the West's catastrophic attempts at state building.
So it is the policy of the United States to seek and support the growth of democratic movements and institutions in every nation and culture with the ultimate goal of ending tyranny in our world.
And let's be honest, this is kinda sorta still how we frame global politics today. The Biden administration still lays out a vision that's a product of a cartoonish version of Enlightenment theories of progress, all against a background historical frame of a collision between autocracy and democracy.
American leadership is what holds the world together. American alliances are what keep us, America, safe. American values are what make us a partner that other nations want to work with.
But we haven't had spread of democracy since about 2003, when democratic globalization reached a plateau and began to decline. And we know this story doesn't add up, but we keep saying it. And here is Biden admitting to this.
We are at an inflection point, I believe, in the world. It occurs every 3 or 4 generations. And now is a time when things are shifting. There's going to be a new world order out there, and we've got to lead it, and we've got to unite the rest of the free world in doing it.
It is a kind of post-apocalyptic situation where we have half chapters, torn pages that describe a previous world order that we can no longer recover. We carry them around as tokens without knowing how to apply them to a world that contains China, that contains Singapore, that contains Dubai, which shows that modernization means capitalism, means technological globalization, but not necessarily democracy. Autocracies are no less modern than democracies, and the story of our world ain't democratization, it's fragmentation, fragmentation, fragmentation. This is scary, and it's also scary that the world's preeminent power, America, is showing signs of fragility, volatility, unpredictability in its capacity to sustain global reach, all made worse by dysfunctionality at home that bodes badly for US capacity to project global power. Meanwhile, China and Russia, and to a lesser extent India, trying to assert themselves, exploit US weakness, and accelerate the fragmentation and disorder of the world and use it to their advantage. We're already in a Cold War with China, and that Cold War is taking place in a more diffuse, in a more complex world than the world we knew in the 20th century Cold War. What we've got now is not bipolarity or multipolarity, but messy polarity. We're going to see more conflict, often played out simultaneously, and that conflict is going to be more complex. Now, during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union and their proxies engaged in many conflicts simultaneously. But in the new world, the carousel of global conflict will be played by more players who will be playing more games at the same time. Whatever conflict you look at, you're going to see not 2, but 6 or 7 games being played at the same time. And often one party to the conflict will play a multiplicity of games, some of which will get in each other's way. We'll see looser, shifting, transitory alliances, with powers taking the same side in one conflict, but being on opposite sides in another. We're coming into a world, and read my lips here, of enemies in certain respects. Let's look at how this maps onto the biggest conflicts in the world. Take Russia-Ukraine. As Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine continues, Ukraine is increasingly becoming a site for the working out of global conflicts between major and medium powers, from China to Iran, from USA to Turkey. Now, on the face of it, there are clear sides in this conflict. The West is on Ukraine's side. It wants Ukraine to survive, and it also wants the conflict not to escalate. But the reality is more ambiguous because there are multiple games being played at the same time. The West wants Russia to lose, but it doesn't seem to want Russia to lose badly. That's partly because the West lacks a coherent strategy towards Ukraine and Russia. We'll come back to that in a moment. But it's also a product of the limited strategy that the West does have. The concern in the minds of some US policymakers is that an absolute defeat for Russia doesn't help the United States in its Cold War with China. They think that weakening Russia absolutely can push it into China's arms for a long time, when what America needs is a Russia that can meaningfully conflict with China. So on that logic, the USA could choose an outright defeat for Russia if China didn't exist, allowing for issues of nuclear escalation management, of course. Now, I think that this is a misguided strategy because a defeated post-Putin Russia is better for the world and better for America in its Cold War with China. But whether I like it or not, that strategy seems to be there. So the USA, in our fragmented world, wants Ukraine to survive without a total victory. Let's have a moment of deep empathy for Ukraine, because it's a tough balancing act it finds itself in. You know, having the backing of somebody who backs you but doesn't want to back you all the way. That's hard. And that really means that Ukraine is a tragic victim of a world of enemies in certain respects. And the same carousel of state actors playing a multiplicity of games applies to Israel, Hamas, or India and China. China wants to be together with India in conflicting with the West, but not so far as to undermine its own position in the conflicts it has with India. So a world of enemies in certain respects. Just as there is a multiplicity of games being played, so there is a multiplicity of kinds of motivation for conflict. The post-1989 end of history Western myth would have us believe not just that we're converging on democracy, but that we're converging on the causes of conflict and war in the world. This myth is rife in the West. It's a cartoonish version of the Enlightenment idea that you can model state action on an idealized rational individual. But in the real world, since the end of the Cold War, regimes are increasingly driven by an ill-assorted package of motivations that includes religion and mysticism, not just territory, resources, and security. Take the unconstructive violence of Hamas across their history, but in particular in their recent barbaric attack on Israeli civilians. Some of the Hamas motivations make sense to us in terms of what we think of as political advantage. They try to scare Israelis, bring attention to their cause, and provoke an overreaction from Israel. But on top of these motivations, they were also motivated by transformation and purification through violence, detached from political advantage. And let's take Putin and his brutal invasion of Ukraine. Many thinkers, including the realist international relations scholar John Mearsheimer and leftist intellectuals like Noam Chomsky, see Putin's invasion of Ukraine as a reaction to NATO expansion.
That the United States pushed forward policies toward Ukraine that Putin and his colleagues see as an existential threat to their country.
But in truth, NATO expansion doesn't play a central role in the cause of the war. Here is what Mearsheimer misses. He doesn't just miss Putin's internal regime security reasons for war. He also misses how far the war is caused by Putin's mystical thought. Remember, we're talking about a plurality of motivations here, and Putin is motivated by a quasi-mystical desire to overturn the global order, insofar as there is one. And that thought for him is coupled with the idea of Russian culture being inextricably intertwined with the will of a single individual that needs to be expressed via a kind of escalation against the West that uses Ukraine as a prop to achieve its ends. Let's recap where we are. We talk as though it's 1998, and we address a semi-imaginary world with semi-serious solutions. This leads us to misunderstand our foes, float without strategy, while uttering pleasant words about a rules-based world order that is irrevocably consigned to the past. And we do this instead of reimagining the international order in a way that accords with the realities we face. And here, to the question you all want to ask, where is the order in this world, comes a weak answer, which says that Mr. Putin broke the order in February 2022 when he brutally invaded Ukraine. But a better way to think about the world is to say that Mr. Putin brutally invaded Ukraine because there was no rules-based international order. So it's not surprising that the West doesn't have a clear strategy for what victory in Ukraine looks like. But it's worse than that. The West doesn't have a strategy for how to deal with Russia. And I'd go further. I don't really think the West has a Russia policy today. Russia is telling us that it wants to kill us. It's making nuclear threats, which we discussed in a recent video on this channel. And we don't have a policy in response. Having a Russia policy doesn't just mean thinking about our long-term security vis-à-vis Russia. It also means politicizing the Russian space, thinking and talking about a post-Putin future on the Russian space. And because we don't do that, we play into Mr. Putin's hands, because us not doing that aids and abets his project of keeping a hold on power. And things get much more serious, because it's not just that we under-strategize our response to our foes, it's also that we face serious problems at home that constrain our capacity to lead on the international stage. I just heard a distinguished panel talk about what a US president needs to say in a speech to morally galvanize the United States into clarity about what it needs to do in Taiwan, Ukraine, and the Middle East. But making the best speech on earth to a society that is in democratic decline could be a bit like writing out a check for payment in a remote tribe that doesn't use the institution of money. Doesn't matter how many zeros you add onto the check, it's not going to get anybody to do anything. So we have to start with a realistic understanding of our capacities before we can act effectively. Here is the problem America faces. In 2024, whether Biden or Trump wins, and as of the time this video is being recorded, it's looking 50-50 edging toward Trump. But whatever the outcome, there is going to be a legitimacy crisis in the United States because tens of millions of voters are going to find the outcome illegitimate. Even if they're completely delusional, that's going to be how they feel. And a crisis and a volatility of this kind is absolutely conducive to weakness on the international stage, to withdrawal, and to perceptions of weakness and expectation of US withdrawal. The rest of the world knows this and will try to take advantage. Mr. Putin is in the Kremlin with his strategy of waiting for Western exhaustion. He is hoping desperately that Mr. Trump wins, but he thinks that even if Biden wins, there is going to be sufficient volatility in the United States to edge him closer toward his goal of feeling confident enough to challenge NATO and challenge Article 5 later on in this decade. We can't solve our problems abroad until we start solving our problems at home. So what can we do about this? First, we've got to realize that our boat has come out of the bay and has gone out into open ocean. But we won't sink because democracies do not die just because they're in crisis. But that means accepting that our crisis of democracy is not an aberration, and accepting that the global wave of populism is an expression of a crisis of trust in institutions as big as anything we've seen since the European revolutions of 1848. Second, we can't blame populism. There's a lot of bad populism about, but not all populism is bad. Populism isn't itself the problem. It's an expression of deeper problems that lie beneath. So what are they? First, this, the internet, a series of democratically unregulatable public squares that dreadfully disinhibit us and put us into a bunch of distinct mental worlds. Second, we have weakening social bonds, fluid societies which are coming apart with untethering intergenerational, communal, professional bonds. Third, we have exclusion and long-term evaporation of economic opportunity for a lot of people. Fourth, we have contagious ideologies of self-realization that stop us from dealing with our problems in terms of solidarity and the public good. And how do people feel about this? Well, they feel betrayed, they feel powerless, but worse, they feel lost, which is a feeling of finding politics alien, finding politics opaque, a kind of unintelligible game that's played according to rules that don't make sense and isn't worth bothering with. All of these vulnerabilities need to be understood, and this is where our responsibility as citizens comes in, and this is the third point. Our immediate responsibility as citizens is not to catastrophize what's happening, but also not to deny it. Any constructive steps to renew democracy, whether it's through local political engagement or through transformation of our understanding of how change is made, or through learning to share the table of politics with people that we terribly don't like and scare us, all of that required us admitting the problem, but at the same time not thinking that it's worse than it is. Let's simplify this even more. Do you want to beat Putin, challenge China effectively, tackle the climate crisis, avoid World War III, keep Ukraine and Taiwan free? Then keep your democracy. And the starting point for keeping your democracy is taking responsibility as a citizen, not just for those parts of your society which you like, but for all of it. And we've seen how catastrophically the Russian population failed to take political responsibility. And to learn more about what's at stake when we fail to be politically responsible, watch this video next.